begin, is it okay if I thank some people?
Sure.
Well, I'd like just to thank UMass Amherst, of course, for hosting this incredible tournament. I also want to thank all the people who have really helped make this Northeastern British parliamentary debating circuit a reality. So people like Eric Barnes at Hobart, Nicole and Tuna Snyder at Vermont. Because of you guys. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into my points. And I think we're debating a really, really important topic here, and that's the embedding of journalists. And the way we're going to define this plan is we're going to say that the United States Congress is going to legislate that journalists are no longer going to be welcome to be embedded with military personnel in wars overseas, right? Just to be clear, embedding of journalists is like a journalist traveling and living with a platoon or a squadron of soldiers, following them around day to day, reporting back to their superiors, whatever, on the happenings and military activity that's been happening on a day-to-day basis, right? So that's what we're talking about. The kind of things that we've seen, kind of evolved through the Gulf War, and that's kind of been a mainstay of war coverage since then, has been this embedding of journalists. And I have a couple points why I believe we should be in favor of this resolution, and Maria's going to come up here when I'm done speaking and give you another point to support that. The first point that I want to talk about is how can we wage war effectively, right? Because war is always an option of last resort. It always should be an option of last resort. We should only go to war when we are absolutely certain that we have exhausted all other options. And when we do go to war, we should follow the Powell Doctrine, which says that we should use overwhelming military force to achieve our objectives as quickly as possible, right? That's the goal of waging an effective war, in order to pursue and protect American interests. And I believe that embedding journalists goes contrary to that ethic of waging an effective war, right? Because in a post-9/11 wars, in a post-9/11 world, the kind of wars that we're fighting aren't wars where two big superpowers are kind of, fighting at each other from a distance, using our, high strike fighter pilots and helicopters and stuff from a long distance, and having a relatively, non-bloody, in terms of like images battlefield. We're fighting in urban environments where there are going to be civilian casualties. That's just a fact of the way that the enemy that we are fighting will hide among civilians, and civilians will be killed in us trying to capture or kill these terrorists, right? Unfortunately, media manipulation is a tool that these terrorists can and do use against us in order to further their interests, right? In some cases, it might be more effective for a terrorist organization to be able to manipulate the media spin coming out of a certain conflict than it is for them to actually kill our soldiers, right? Do you disagree?
Yeah, I'd like to know how we're supposed to wage democracy effectively if we don't know what's going on unless we tell.
Well, I believe that some of my points, my second independent point here is going to talk about what the effects of democracy are. But I think if we're talking about how to best win a war that is going to pursue the democratic interest, you can't have the democracy if you don't win the war to establish democracy first, right? So I believe that this whole idea of having embedded journalists, what it does is it gives the journalists are reporting every day on the activities of the soldiers, right? They're reporting their locations, what they're doing, the sweeps that they're on, and so on and so forth. So aside from just the military information that we're giving our enemies by having these embedded journalists, which is a bad thing in and of itself, that media coverage itself can then be manipulated by those same terrorists in order to achieve the kind of political spin that they want, right? We can see this recently in the conflict in Gaza, where the Hamas has been using public opinion as its primary tool to fight the Israelis, right? They're not really interested in killing Israeli soldiers as much as they're interested in getting Israeli soldiers to kill Palestinian civilians so that they can then plaster those images on every single CNN station across the world, right? So what's the impact to this is I believe that we're in a world in which we allow journalists to be embedded, we are waging less effective wars, and we are less able to protect the interests of the United States, both at home and abroad. And those interests, as my oppositions brought up in the point of interest, is the spreading of democracy, the promoting of democracy, the promoting of a just society where civil liberties are respected, right? So if we're less able to pursue our goals, to have that be the end goal of our wars, then that, I believe, is a negative consequence. No, thank you. But secondly, and I think even more importantly, what embedding journalists in military platoons does is it propagates the 24-hour news cycle. And not only does it propagate it, but the 24-hour news cycle is kind of a child of this whole trend of embedding journalists, right? We saw in the first Gulf War, which was the first war that was really kind of heavily covered by the 24-hour news channels like CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, etc., that because they had journalists embedded there, they had a story to report on every single day, right? And not only did they have a story to report on, but they had negative stories to report on every single day, right? And that kind of made that format a viable format, where before it wasn't really a viable format. People weren't interested in purchasing a 24-hour news channel before the advent of journalists being embedded. And I believe that the transition that has happened to this state that we're now in, where there's at any given moment there's probably around 800,000 people in the United States watching CNN or one of the rival networks. But what happens is, by its nature, the 24-hour news cycle is meant to propagate fear and negative coverage, right? Anytime you want, just sit down, watch CNN for 30 minutes, and count to yourself how many positive stories there are, like babies born, or something awesome happened in America on this day, right? And how many of it is 4 more people got shot in Detroit today, right? More people got laid off. More people, some guy showed up at a Christmas party and kills his ex-wife's family, right? These are the kinds of things that the news media reports. They overwhelmingly report these kind of negative things. And why do they do that? Because that's what sells advertising dollars, right? At the end of the day, that's what they're interested in doing, is selling these advertising dollars. What's the effect of this, ladies and gentlemen? The effect of this is that all of us living in America believe that America is a less stable and a less safe place. Not only America, but the entire world, right? We are actually scared of things that actually have probably no chance of ever affecting us, right? We look at, for example, the coverage of terrorism coverage. 3,000 people died on 9/11. Thousands of people are dying every day from some of the most trivial things that you could imagine, right? We're still in a situation where traffic accidents are killing thousands of our people, right? So what it does is it skews the priorities of the populace and makes them more likely to buy into a government telling them that they have to reduce their civil liberties in order to be more safe. And in a world in which you can be convinced that some civil liberties are okay to be taken away, Madam Speaker, then that is a world in which all your civil liberties can be taken away. We should never put ourselves in a position in which we are able to negotiate away some of our rights. Rights are absolute. They don't exist unless we have all of them. And so for this reason, that the 24-hour news cycle, propagated by embedded journalists, propagates this destruction of our civil liberties, and because it makes us less effective to wage war to protect America's interests, that's why I believe we must propose this resolution.
Thank you very much for setting up the debate for us. For the opening opposition, we have Cornell B.
Just as quickly as a brief roadmap, I'm going to go ahead and go into some refutation of the points that government has decided to bring up today, and then I'm going to go ahead and go into some points of my own, which I feel are what should be paramount within this round. All right, so going ahead and looking at government's case, we can see that they, their first point is that they talk about, well, we need to wage war effectively, and we can't do this when journalists are there. Well, the fact of the matter that we really need to look at is that we have humane wars in some sense, because we have journalists, because there's accountability in government. This is what I'm going to go ahead and talk about in my new matter, so I won't touch on it too much. So secondly, they kind of talk about how it propagates negative, I guess you could thinking, and that people are always bombarded with these negative images and bad things that happen. I'm sorry to bring it to government, but we don't live in La La Land. Like nothing, we aren't in like in a nation where everything's okay. We know that there's conflict. We know that bad things happen. And specifically, looking at the examples that he cited about people capping each other in Detroit. I mean, we're not even talking about like people in the United States. We're talking about journalists going overseas and being able to tell the people of the United States what the heck's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with my new matter and talking about what we need to do in today's debate. So I want to go ahead and talk to you about the upholding the founding principles that this country was founded on. So we know that we have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of justice, pursuit of happiness. Sorry. And so, but we also know that within the the Bill of Rights, that we have freedom of the press, is that we can't simply allow the government to censor what we're actually going to be hearing. This is something that is inherently bad. And so we already know that there's a historical precedent against this kind of censorship. As a specific, I'll get to you in a minute. As a specific example, we can look at the Fairness Doctrine, which was supposed to kind of regulate what kind of things that the people of the United States were hearing on TV with the different political parties. And we know that this was repealed because it's something that we simply could not regulate, that everybody had the right to information that they wanted to. It goes back to freedom of choice. Individuals have the right to choose what and what they don't want to hear. Yes, sir.
Ma'am, with the existence of regulatory agencies such as the FCC, have we already made the decision that government has the ability and has the obligation
I understand
to
what you're
censor
saying, but no,
themselves when it's for the better
people,
good?
no, government does not have the right to censor the amount of information they get. When the FCC, what they actually do is regulate the kind of vulgarity that can appear on television. This is something that we need to see. It's not vulgar to understand and see what is going on at wars overseas. What we need to make sure and understand is that if we go ahead and pass this resolution, that we're stomping on the founding principles that this government was founded on. So I want to go ahead and look at this impact of this, of kind of getting away from the freedom of the press. And that is that we're on the slippery slope to socialism if we allow the government to go ahead and censor what we're saying. And this is inherently bad because we don't want government to go ahead and regulate whatever we're doing. So I want to go ahead and talk about another new point of matter. It's called accountability in judgment, or in government, in an age of international warfare. Oh, but before I go ahead.
So let me take you seriously. Like, are you not only going to embed these troops, but allow them to say all the information that these troops are actually doing?
I understand. Okay, and this ties perfectly into my third point, so I'll go ahead and jump right in. So I want to give you an example about Vietnam. Up until Vietnam, nobody really knew what war was. We kind of thought that it was just kind of this thing that happens overseas, and people sometimes die, but we didn't really know what was going on. But as soon as the news media started going to Vietnam, we could actually see and understand and grasp what war is. It's not pretty, and it's something that was related to the American people, which is something that is very good. And we also know that it discouraged support for the American people. And this is a perfect example of how we stopped the war, because individuals were not happy with what government was doing. Another example of accountability in government, we can look at the examples of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. We can see that these these journalists were able to bring to light the atrocities that were being committed in these areas. And this is something that is very good because we're keeping the government accountable. We're allowing them to go ahead and to be more humane in this kind of conflict. And so I want to talk to you a little bit also about why trust in government is very important. When individuals do not trust the government, when the government is operating secretly under this kind of veil, we can see that it's something that's not very good because it creates this divide between government and the people. And once you keep this divide open, what you're essentially doing is not allowing the people of the United States to trust in government. And when this happens, there's nothing left to defend. Go ahead.
Let me ask this again. So are you counterpropping that journalists should be allowed to say whatever they want when they're embedded with these troops?
Well, obviously, there are some censorships in journalism. What we're saying is that you can't not allow journalists to go ahead and report on what's happening overseas. We're saying that if you allow them to travel with the troops, if you allow them to be embedded with the battalions, what you're essentially doing is you're allowing the real truth to be reported. I would rather be hearing from a journalist who's actually seeing things with the troops with that stuff that's going on than a journalist who's going AWOL and doing whatever the heck he wants to do. So what we're actually doing is we're creating this accountability, and we're making sure that the right facts are being brought up within the whole schema of things. No. So quickly, just to kind of sum up, what we really want to focus on here is that government here is trying to demean the founding principles of what this country was founded on. What we need to make sure is that we uphold these principles, that we allow there to be freedom of the press, that we don't censor anything. Because guess what? It's not good if we go down the slippery slope to socialism, something that simply cannot be tolerated. And we also know that individuals have the right to be informed. The people of the United States have this right to understand and know what is happening in our government, what is happening overseas, and what we're doing. And why do we need this? Because it creates the accountability in government, which is something that is very good. I've given you numerous examples of how journalists have kept the government in check. And this is something that needs to be able to happen, because if not, we're going to have a mass amount of chaos, which is essentially bad. So we can see that government's plan today is not going to help wage war effectively, because guess what? It's just going to be waging war without any kind of accountability, which is bad. We need to make sure that the government is accountable for its actions and what it does. And they're trying, and also government, all it's trying to do is trying to say that journalism is bad, and journalism does all these bad things. But guess what? It doesn't perpetuate negativity. People perpetuate negativity. Each individual has a right, whether or not they want to turn on or turn off the television. We're just giving them a choice. We're giving the people of the United States the choice to listen to what they want to listen to. And for these reasons, I strongly stand in opposition of today's resolution. Thank you.
All right, the second speaker for the first government.
Okay, I'm going to reconstruct my partner's points. I'm going to re-establish what the round is. I'm going to refute a little bit, and then I'm going to go into my own independent points. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank Leah for giving me 7 minutes to flow out my next point, because I really didn't hear too much coming out of her speech. She talks a lot, but she said not much. She says nothing. She's giving you all these claims, but I felt that there were no warrants coming out of her speeches. She's throwing all these buzzwords at you, like civil liberties and Guantanamo, but none of her examples apply to embedded journalism. And I feel that this fact of the matter is that the opposition gets up here and tries to slander our claims that we're making by not making any claims or warrants or examples or implications of themselves. And I think that point needs to be brought up. So basically Joe gets up here and he wants to talk about why war is effective. And war is the option of last resort, obviously, but embedded journalists do not have American interests at heart. And the fact that this is a technologically based society, and the fact that the terrorist group and the insurgent groups and the people that we are fighting realize that they can use the media to hurt us very severely. They are using the media to defeat us on the home front. And I think that this fact really needs to be addressed. At the point in which we are allowing ourselves with this embedded journalism to reach us on the home front unbeknownst to us, that we are conceding a front of this war that is not to be conceded. We need to be able to protect ourselves on many fronts. In World War II, we realized this is a multi-front war. I'm not using that as like a verbatim type of example, but you know what I mean. Now he gets up here and I think this is very important. He's talking about propagating the 24-hour news cycle. And I think this is very important when you realize the fact of constant fear. Yeah. Why should Americans, as a free and liberal democracy, have to live in a state of constant fear? As far as I was concerned, that was just a totalitarian government that had to live in a state of constant fear when they were worried about their civil liberties being encroached upon. In America, we do not have to worry about our civil liberties to be encroached upon. But however, under side opposition, when they are having this concentrated fear being inflicted on them, they are willing to go to civil liberty. There's coercion by subconsciousness because they want to feel safe by giving up their safety and the ability to be safe because of this war front, which is not being addressed. Leah.
Yeah, I think there's a unique relationship between the viewers when what they're wanting to look at are things like what's happening with their sons and daughters and their fathers and their husbands overseas.
Okay, and I think I will more than adequately address this when I go on into my points, but I'm going to do a little bit of a little more refutation of what Leah had said in the points. Now, I want to bring up first and foremost, I know I was a little bit towards the bottom of her flow, but we talked about the FCC and how she says it only regulates vulgarity. But about 3.5 minutes later, she says, verbatim, you can play it back on those tapes. Wait, she denies their existence. Joe POI'd it, and she said, no, that's not what they do. And I think that the contradiction in her own speech, it goes back to my point of, she talks a lot, she says not much. So she wants to say that we have this impact of slippery slope to socialism. And I would like to point out again, this is a warrant, or a claim with no warrants. Because how do you go from talking about embedded journalism to socialism? Socialism is the collective ownership of a means of production. That is not embedded journalism. And I'm sorry, your rhetoric may be flawed, and it may not come across as what you had wanted it to, but I believe that for the point of this debate, that is inherently flawed. She says that she rebuts Joe's point of propagating negative thinking. But what we're proposing on side government is not what she's claiming is us creating this utopia and for everyone to live in. But we're simply saying that the overstating of these tales that the journalists are bringing back to our home front are completely degrading what it is to be American and how we are to exist in this country in a free and liberal democracy. Now, I'm going to go into my own constructive points, and I'll take, and once I get into my constructive material. Now, my point is the civilian-military relationship, and I think that this is very pivotal in the fact of this embedded journalist thing, because you cannot have a civilian and military relationship, and you don't have one party working with the other. You can't have a military without the support of the civilians. And you can't have a protection of the civilians without the support of the military. Korey.
Exactly, and the relationship between the citizens and the military is embedded journalism. That's how we get our information about the military.
Okay, I understand that, but in war times, you have to harbor the support of the people. Now, I'm going to go on and talk about the effects on this. So, outside of the war, the civilian-military relationship has a very strong grasp on how we function as a country. Now, as Joe said, the 24-hour news station is a constant dish out of information. It's constantly browbeating these people. They're bringing them down to their knees. They're showing them the worst, the ugliest, and the grossest. But we can't do that in the sight of war. We have to be able to understand that there are things that on a home front you don't need to know. You can't know as a civilian. This is exclusive information. Now, the impacts of this is like I said in my introduction to this point, is we need one to support the other. Because if you don't have civilian support of the government or the military, then you lose recruitment, not just on soldiers, nurses, cooks, mechanics, drivers, operators, desk shops, reserves, and God forbid the draft. If the draft were to ever be inflicted and everyone was like, oh, hell no, then we are completely ineffective as a country, and therefore we can't stand for what we're trying to impose as a Western liberal democracy in where we're trying to reach out. Now, this is a sick, cyclical cycle that could be inflicted if you were to agree with side op. You will not have the type of relationship that perpetuates good Western liberal democracies being instated where they needed to be. Now, the basic relationship of a democratic government is to have the support of its people to best protect and serve them. If the relationship of civilian and military needs to be very, very strong for this in order to be effective. Now, the impact of this is a very less safe America. And as I brought up in my previous points and my refutation and my reconstruction, you cannot sacrifice your civil liberties because you're scared. You're supposed to be guaranteed your civil liberties because you are able to be protected. The protection guarantees your civil liberties, and I think this illustrates furthermore my point of the cyclical process. And you cannot have one exist without the other. You have to stand back to back and arm to arm to be able to continue to rise on this globe. America is trying to perpetuate a good image in this international community. And I believe the fact that we need to support the military, and the military needs to be able to do its job to protect us without the embedded journalism, without this 24-hour news cycle, without having to live in fear because of what we see. This is a gross exaggeration, and therefore I implore you, Madam Speaker and dear panel, as well as my colleagues and audience, we do not need this embedded journalism to be effective. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to be here today. This is a very important issue to me, and it looks like I have my work cut out for me to try and cover 7 minutes of rebuttal. So I'll try and get right into it. So first of all, we've heard from the side of the government their arguments that we need to restrict the press for our civil liberties, but this is a severe internal conflict. They're saying to get rid of civil liberties, to uphold civil liberties by restricting the freedom of press. This is not what side opposition stands for. We have advocated the status quo, which allows the journalists to be embedded with the troops, to present the reality of war to the people, to not try and hide behind the veil of uncertainty, behind the veil of lack of information, to wage these secret wars, and to allow atrocities of war to continue without the people's consent. And that's what side opposition stands for. We stand for more than just the American people, but we also stand for the innocent people around the world that deserve to have support and knowledge of the situation that is at hand and the situations we are facing today. So as a rebuttal to some of the main arguments, The journalists, no thank you, have in their best interest the Americans. They become a part of the platoon. They work with these people. They learn what they're like. They learn the realities of war and can present the most truthful image. Look at during World War II, we had lots of propaganda and just a one-sided, strictly government view of the war for its own support and propagation. No thank you. Because we could not have a realistic story of what was going on and that could actually bring more truthful support to the people. And a free society, what is a free society if the government turns off the TV for you, which they keep advocating? People, if there's so much negativity, then you can turn off the TV if you no longer want to see the reality of it. But you know what many people do because they want to be active in our government, they want to know what's going on, and that's why we live in a free society. Thank God for the Constitution. So, and then there's been the question of the SEC, but you know what? They regulate vulgarity and the manner and the quality that information is presented. They don't regulate information at its basic point, which is what they want to do. And people will be more behind a war if there's trust, which is one of the most important principles that the government must have with its people. The people must be able to trust the intentions of their government, because look what's happened recently. We feel that the government is just going into Iraq for oil, that we're not really helping the people, that there's no trust. We have to have trust if you want to wage a true war, a moral war, if that is truly what is the last option on America's plate. So into some of my new matter. I'm going to first talk about journalistic security and also the quality of journalism. And one second, please. And then second, I'll also be talking about how war is waged in the modern world. Yes.
Can you please tell me where the warrant for your claim is that these media are going to be objective and embedded within these troops?
They're very objective because they're not just getting information that's fed to them by some head honcho in the government or by some head honcho in the military. Finally, they get to go on the ground and see what's happening, rather than just having this veil of information and just being fed, you know, a pile of you-know-what from somebody who may have a different interest, a different type of motive at heart. And that's what we're getting at. We're getting at true information. No, thank you. So first of all, journalistic security. You know what? Let's face it. They're going to be there no matter what, because at least many of the journalists still have the interest of information at heart. And we have seen from in countless wars that journalists have been harmed or even killed in the line of fire because, you know what? Often they are not granted permission to be embedded with the troops. They don't have the security. And the government talks about how it's so important that the terrorists, as they have not really, you know, defined who that is, nonetheless, our enemies will manipulate the press. Well, then one problem is the best way we can have fair, balanced information to win the hearts and minds of civilians and people abroad is to be able to have good, clean, protected information that can be given out. And some examples of times that journalists have not been protected that has resulted in tragedy. Look at Daniel Pearl of the Wall Street Journal, who was abroad in the Middle East, who was captured, tortured, and killed. That is manipulation of information, where the terrorists put him on camera and decapitated him and let the family send pictures to the family of the atrocities that were committed. That is where there was no security. That's where there was no freedom of press. That is where the injustice occurred, the imbalance of information, and we are here to make sure that is not what happens, that we keep the journalist security at heart. And withholding the safety and health of these trying to uphold the basic human rights is an atrocity on the side of the United States, and we need to uphold the founding principles that my partner has talked about. Because if there is no longer these principles, then, ladies and gentlemen, we have nothing left to fight for. Why don't we just give up now? Yes.
Would you agree that for someone whose only information source is watching the news, that they would come out with the opinion that the world is a worse off place than it actually is?
So now are they all just going to get to watch Al Jazeera? Because clearly we're not going to have any good information coming out of the United States publications. And that's one of the problems here. You want it to just censor the information, only let it come down from, you know, high seats of power, from people who may not have individuals' best interests at heart. So let's have trust in the government, let's have people on the ground, and let's have them on the ground safely so there is no corruption of information and where they don't have to be afraid about what information they can present, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. So next, briefly, I want to talk about how war is waged. Look here, now we're beginning to hear about let's uphold the moral high ground. Because the government has talked about how we are waging wars in civilian territories, in civilian areas. And we have to win the hearts and minds of the people. One of the best ways to do that is to become more humane. And the press will help to attain that, because it keeps the reality of war inside of what we can at least consider human. We won't see the atrocities, the raping and pillaging of individuals, because we would have to watch it on the evening news. This keeps the troops in check, and it keeps the government in check, and this is what's so crucial. And winning the moral high ground is also important for winning wars. This gives us a strategic advantage if we have fair information coming out of the military and out of these military units. So it gives them accountability to the troops. It becomes a more effective strategy to win the hearts and minds of the people. And it gives our perspective that can't be manipulated and twisted and turned by the enemy. And you can see that the Iraq situation is finally beginning to improve, that we have been able to work with certain civilian groups. Even the Sunnis were staunchly against the United States in the first place, and they are now working on a vote of a new Iraqi constitution. We've also seen in Afghanistan that we've been able to give aid to rural farmers, and that they're no longer afraid to stand up to local fighters that are against U.S. interests. So journalism has changed the way it's waged, and collateral damage has been reduced, and we are more effective at winning wars because of the power of information. So ladies and gentlemen, uphold the rights of the Constitution, uphold the rights of the United States, and I beg you to oppose this motion. Thank you.
All right, to the table, each
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to address real quickly the one big assumption, which my partner alluded to, which you've seen mostly from side opposition, you saw it a little bit from side government, and we think we can show you that either way, embedded journalism is bad. The big assumption is that these journalists are reporting from an objective perspective. And we think that's clearly not the case. What side opposition just told you is that this is far better than like World War II when we had government propaganda, but I think it's far worse, because when propaganda begins masquerading as objectivity, then you get real problems. You get people who think they have real information and they don't. And in the long run, that comes back and bites democracy hard, and we think that that's a very bad system. So first I'm going to go down our extension to this debate, which is based around the idea of freedom of the press and how embedding journalists in the long run is definitely hurtful to freedom of the press and more generically to democracy as a whole. And then I'm going to deal with tying up some loose ends from the front half of the debate. But first, we agree with side opposition on one point, that freedom of the press is essentially at heart a way to connect to democracy, how people get their information. But what we firmly stand opposed to is the idea that these people are getting the right information. We think it's very hard to say that journalists are telling you the truth, or at the very least, the whole truth, when they're embedded within military platoons. They're giving you this idea of embedded journalism, where it's kind of like, oh, the journalists kind of shadow platoons. They go off, they do their own thing, whatnot. That's not how it works. They live with these soldiers. These soldiers are responsible for their protection. They cannot give information that's going to harm these soldiers, and if there's something the government or these soldiers don't want getting out, it's not going to get out, because these are the people who these journalists' livelihoods depend upon. There is no way, I'll take you in just a second, Korey, that you can say this information is at all objective. Sure.
Sir, how do you decipher truth, fact, or subjective leaning? It's because another journalist has said that this is not the truth of another journalist. So we think the benefit is knowing information from truth and false.
Okay, I didn't really catch all of that, but I think what he said is eventually that somehow there's going to be like multiple journalists and they're all going to eventually pick out the truth. I don't think that's what's going to happen. You don't often see journalists like competing over, oh, he got it wrong, I've got the inside scoop, because unfortunately there's only like one or two journalists embedded within this platoon, and they're all subject to the same type of problem. The fact that their perspective and what they can do and what they can let out is subject to what the military allows them to know. I mean, this is clearly just a basic idea of self-interest. Of course, the military isn't going to let people do these things if it's damaging. The government's not going to let people tell, oh yeah, we were with the platoon, and then the platoon went off and they killed some children and they raped some women, and that's what happened. The government's not going to let that kind of thing get out. You're not getting objective information. And we think that that is problematic on two levels. First, the people aren't getting actual objective information. But it's more problematic, we think, if actual objective information somehow leaks out, because then what happens? The government shuts down the channels by which you get any information out of it. You don't get anything. no one can be reporting to you about what the government's doing. All of the media channels, all of those civilian checks shut down. So essentially what you're getting is a choice between limited civilian access, limited civilian checks, and in the long run, no democratic checks, because the civilian channels and the checks on the government shut down if stuff the government doesn't want to get out ends up getting out. And we think that you definitely go for the side with information about the government, albeit limited, over information that in the long run doesn't even get to you because the government doesn't want it getting out, because they learn that if journalists do what they're telling you they do, they learn journalists can't be trusted with this kind of information that the government doesn't want getting out. We think that this is just a basic idea of human interest. Now, what you'll notice is essentially that this directly clashes with the entirety of First Ops case. First, they told you, I'll take you in just 1 second, Leah, they told you that we're upholding principles, that like in the end, we need to be able to do this. Not in the long run, you're not, because you're undermining the very principles that you're seeking to uphold by embedding journalists. And again, you're not getting actual journalistic accountability, which is their second point, because the journalistic information is not as pure as they want you to believe it is. And what's the real impact is that even if it is, you can't be sure it is. So you have no idea. Sure.
I think government has a self-interest to not be shown a liar when those soldiers go home and tell the real story.
Why are these soldiers going home and telling the real story? Again, self-interest. Where is your pension coming from? Who controls your livelihood? Why are they going to do these things? We think that that's, again, look at what's going to happen in the system. We think that that's clearly not going to happen. But just like First Government told you, let's assume that this information is true. Is it worth the costs that you incur to get this information? And we think it's not, because it completely undermines your ability to wage an effective war. Now, First Opposition kind of glazed over this. They're like, oh, well, you wage more effective war because you have the moral high ground. Ladies and gentlemen, wars are not won from the moral high ground. Wars are won with the PAL doctrine, which is overwhelming military force. It's kind of hard to be on the moral high ground when you have to carpet bomb Iraq, which means civilian casualties, in order to gain that final measure of victory. We think that these two ideas are contradictory, and when you have to pick, you take effective military campaign over what they're advocating on their side, which is smaller checks that in the end don't really get you anything. What they give you is the idea of a moral high ground, and you don't really see it happening. Sure.
How are you upholding the freedom of press by limiting the number of sources of information?
Okay, it's complicated, but in the end, you're limiting freedom of the press. Because, actually, okay, let me put it this way. You're restricting freedom of the press, but as you guys said, freedom of the press is a means to an end of democracy. So what you're preserving is that heightened end of democracy. You're preserving, A, the integrity of the information channels, because you know that the information you're getting is integral. And I made this point earlier, but just to make it clear, the damage comes even if the journalists are honest, because you can't be sure they're being honest. How can you fully trust someone who is backed by the government? You can't trust them to report on the government if they're backed by it. So either way, you get this damage to the integrity of the media channels, and you preserve the democratic underpinning by not allowing embedding of journalists. You limit the freedom of the press, but you save what it's actually trying to protect. You look to the underlying principles, which is what they wanted you to look to, and you look beyond the base, like the slogan that we use. You look beyond that, you look to what you're really trying to protect, and you see that side government definitely has the right idea of what we're trying to protect. So for these reasons, because it's impossible to wage an effective war from the moral high ground that they're trying to get you to accept, because in the long run, if you undermine democratic accountability on the government, you must support side government's plan.
Really great questions from Buzz just now. What I want to do is I want to go into those specific questions. And then I want to go into basically what we saw from the entire case, and then go into what I want to talk about, what the substantial matter that Korey and I believe is really essential. And it's this link that we don't believe has really been made very clearly. This is what happens, what is the implication when citizenry lose trust in their government? And what does this mean for waging democracy, like my first POI to Joe insisted upon? Now, about these really good questions, I find it interesting that Buzz thinks he can ask these really great questions about doubting our government, and is this really true? But he doesn't think that the American people who vote, who choose who these who's our presidents are, can also ask these really great questions. I think that we can trust that the foundation of democracy requires that we have a little bit of faith in our citizenry to be able to do this. So when he says that journalists may be subjective, I mean, he sort of does an if-then, that's great. But if we can't trust what they're saying, basically he's saying citizens aren't going to question it at all. I think that what we've learned from news is that we do have to question it. That's why we have CNN and NBC, and we compare the stories. People look at Wall Street Journal and The Economist. They want to compare the stories. We ask these questions naturally because of the state of being in a democracy. We respect that. Okay, no thank you. She also said that government shuts down the checks of democracy when the citizenry can re-elect or re-vote whomever they want to, depending on whether or not they like what their government is doing. This check and balance is essential to my argument, so I do want to spend a little bit of time on this. Yeah, I'll take you, Joe.
Yeah, on this democracy part, we have to trust the people. Our Constitution is a really convoluted document exactly because we set up a large amount of checks and balances against a pure democratic rule of the majority, right? There's a reason that our Constitution does this because we don't trust pure democracy. So therefore, why should we trust these people to have, to make the correct judgment when they're getting fed biased information?
Okay, thank you. This will pull into the very POI that I asked, actually. We can trust or not trust, depending on what we see coming back later. I think there is some self-interest that the government has. Now, when I asked, soldiers are going to be coming home, right, Joe? Someday, we hope that they will be coming home. And that when they do come home, they're not going to keep quiet about what went on when they were abroad. Now, if the government is shown, I mean, most government election officials want to be reelected, yes. And when they do, they recognize that they probably don't want to have a bunch of soldiers coming back and saying, wow, that administration, let me tell you, what you were being told was not the truth. This makes government, democracy, or Republicans look really bad. They're not going to get reelected. Self-interest. So he said, where are their pensions coming from? Can you give me any examples of where pensions were just shut off? I can't even think that that would look good. And again, the self-interest argument here. So then he says, why is this an effective democracy? How does this help us with the effective war? No, thank you. Now let's look at what an effective war is. And this really pulls into what Joe talked about as well. He says, I mean, if an effective war is not just if you win, who kills the most people and who gains the most ground. It's also, if you do something awful, you kill hundreds of thousands of people, you're going to probably lose allies. You're probably going to look really bad to your constituents and probably not be reelected. This is an effective war. It's more complex than just winning ground and winning bodies. And government understands that. So this takes apart both these points. No, thank you. Now, we also heard, and I really think this propagating 24-hour news cycle, again, my POI, there's a unique relationship between me and the stories that are going on in Iraq. If I have a family member or a friend or someone that I respect in Iraq, I want to know what's going on, and I have the right to know what's going on because that is my family member. And that you cannot deny me the right to know where my son, my daughter, my father, whomever is abroad. So this is not who gets shot in Detroit and all these nameless people. No, thank you, David. So now I want to get into what was really covered a little bit by Leah, but I want to really take this deeper. What she talked about is we're going to lose trust, and she didn't really talk about that much more than that. She said disjointed citizenry. What happens when citizens are disjointed? It means that citizens are not as encouraged to be involved in their government. They take a back row seat. They feel like they have less control over their government. This means we have apathetic voters. And this is a baggage that democracy cannot allow. Because then you see government gone wild. This is when you see governments doing things that you would not believe that they were doing if their citizenry were awake and paying attention to what was going on. If in 9/11 we asked more questions, we might not have been so willing to give up here. Now, this is what happens when we feel like we've lost control. We wake up 8 years later, as some people are doing right now, going, holy hell, what the hell did Bush do to my country? Where has it gone? They were asleep. They were not paying attention to the issues. And this is something, no thank you. This is something that when you lose trust in your government because you think they're hiding something, it will happen. especially if people aren't aware about embedded journalists and they start hearing in the news that the government is not going to allow them now, they're wondering, what is my government really doing? Wow, I don't really know. Okay, no thank you. And this losing trust, not really feeling like this government is of the people, for the people, and for your interests is extremely damaging. Now, this checks and balance, again, no thank you, David, is extremely important. We need people to sit up. We need people to say, this is my government, I want control over it, I want to know what's going on. What is a key essential part of this check and balance? You need information. If the only information that you have is the information the government is telling you, and what you hear from the soldiers who come back maybe months later, when it might be, no thank you, too late, then you're not an educated voter. Pictures, cliche, are worth 1,000 words. When we know what's going on, when we see a picture, let me give you some examples. Who here has seen Hotel Rwanda? All right, a few, okay, it's a shame. When you read about Hotel Rwanda, when you read about the Rwandan genocide in your textbooks, it's something. When you watch what that might have looked like, it's a totally different experience. This is something that it's inexplicable, but it's necessary when you're voting. When you want your legislatures, you're writing a letter and you want your legislatures to make some sort of a decision on an international relations issue, you want to know exactly what's going on, and this is a key component of knowing what is going on, knowing what war actually looks like. And these pictures and these journalists are going to help citizenry know what war actually looks like. This is essential. These pictures are important. We cannot permit our government to allow this trust to be lost, to allow the waging of democracy to no longer be democracy and turn into a fascist government. I don't want to wake up 8 years later, 10 years later, however long it takes, and wonder where my government is going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll close the debate out first.
WH Smith. We're ready. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for calling me up here. The first thing I want to point out in this debate is that I didn't really see a clear extension by St. John's. They came up here and talked about trust, but that's the exact same thing that the second member of First Opposition said. He said, we're restricting the civil liberties, we need to have trust and info in the interest of information. He even gave the example of Daniel Pearl. So we got no clear extension out of Alia, but let me deal with what she did do, because she did a lot of rebuttal. So let me deal with that and then go into my 4 questions of crystallization. The first thing she says, well, what happens when citizens lose trust? American people can vote, American people can ask questions. The question in this debate that opposition needed to show is why it was that embedded journalism proved this better than just other sources of journalism in Twitter. What we have told you is that embedded journalism actually harms the process, harms the freedom of the press, and ultimately suppresses democracy. Those are the harms we gave you. They needed to show you why the positive benefits that you get from freedom of the press are explicitly unique to embedded journalism, why this was a better way of obtaining the truth. We told you that the truth was tainted. The extension given to you by Buzz gave you a dichotomy. It told you either have very little but truthful information, or you can have a lot of false and biased information, because ultimately it is the government that controls the reins of power. At the point at which you have tainted information, you lose all the positive benefits that side opposition has wanted to give you. Because they tell you, you need information in order to be able to make a decision. You need information in order to be able to vote. You need information to do all this. But the thing that they assumed was that all information was truthful. That is not the case. That is the extension we provided you with. Because ultimately recognize that if the government is going to see that these journalists are going to provide information that is contrary to their self-interest, then they're going to shut them out of embedding. It's the government that chooses which journalists are embedded with them. It's the government that holds the reins of power in the relationship with embedded journalists. That's what they refused and what they failed to recognize. It's not the journalist setting up a tent. It's what Buzz said. It's not a journalist setting up a tent out there at the outskirts and then going in and asking questions. It's the government bringing them on board, providing food, providing shelter for them, protecting them, and then forcing them to divulge the information that they think, forcing them not to divulge information that they think might be hurtful. For example, they can't disclose the location of where these individuals are. They can't disclose like what machine guns are used and things of the sort. They can't disclose things that are like to terms of national interest. Well, that's why I asked First Opposition the question, like, are you going to be upholding these values and running a counterprop? They never actually answered this question, members of the panel. They're like we need to have more accountability. We need to have more objectivity. But when the government is not allowing embedded journalists to release all the information, then you don't gain the accountability. You don't gain the objectivity. You don't get any of the positive things things that they wanted you to obtain throughout the entire round. So all of these claims and all of these warrants are completely unjustified. Okay, but let's see what else she tells you.
Please, sir, before you move on.
No. She tells you that, that effective war is more than winning. We agree that effective war is more than simply just winning the war. But we need to, win the war first and then rebuild. There are other things, but winning the war, militarily, is definitely one of the base things we need to do. And we think that that's where first government got their traction from. Secondly, she's like, well, people want to know, and people can find out this information. Great, we will concede that. Why is embedded journalism the only way they can find this information? That was the question that opposition needed to prove. That was the question they failed to prove throughout the entire debate. And especially added to that, the harms that we've given you from embedded journalism, we think that embedded journalism does more harm than good. And ultimately, it's comparative analysis, members of the panel, and we think that we win on that count. Okay, so lastly, she can come up and tell you that, that you're not going to trust your government, that, that there's this whole idea of trust, members of the panel. Okay, it's another dichotomy situation. I'll take you.
Yeah, you keep talking about self-interest contaminating information, but now the government decides what channels are best?
No, I'm describing the status quo to you. I'm describing that the government controls the venues of information. That's what I said. But now, this idea of trust, members of the panel. My partner, again, in his extension gave you this idea. You either have a situation where the government controls what gets out, and you have a false sense of trust, which is even worse, because we think that ultimately, and this is where the extension from Buzz leads, it's that journalism is protected as right because it's a means for the public to gain information, to be able to make informed decisions in order to be able to vote, in order for them to be able to protect their own civil liberties. At the point at which this is threatened, then at that point, Mr. Speaker, the government is infringing on the rights of the individual. That is why we protect journalism. At the point at which the information itself is threatened, members of the panel, we think that the government is persuading and is using propaganda to shape the minds of the people. We think that this is very harmful. But let's look at ultimately the questions of crystallization. And let's look at a couple. The first of these is, can we wage war effectively? The answer is obviously no. We think that ultimately we need to look to self-interest. These individuals who aren't trained are only going to weigh the military platoons down. So ultimately, we think that we need to look to self-interest. Secondly, though, let's look at this question of why exactly do we have freedom of the press? We ultimately have freedom of the press not because we think journalists are cool. We do think they're cool, but that's not the reason why. We have freedom of the press because it's a means to an end. It's a means to an informed public. It's a means for the public to be able to make an objective decision in order for them to be able to vote. So ultimately, members of the panel, when the information is tainted, because the government holds the reins of power, because the government controls what gets out, because if you say something that the government doesn't want to get out, then they'll simply kick you off this embedded situation. They'll simply shut your channel from covering in this kind of a closed situation, and you'll be forced back to the old manner of journalism, which we think ultimately is okay for providing information. Vietnam got information out, members of the panel. We don't think that embedded journalism was that big of a situation back then. It has only become popular since the Gulf War. So we think that it's not necessary in order for you to have the public criticism that they come forward with. The third question, members of the panel, is, does this plan ultimately uphold the freedom of the press? And we think that it does, because the freedom of the press, members of the panel, isn't simply the freedom of the press itself. That's what Buzz told you in his extension. It's a means to other forms of democratization. It's a means to other forms of rights, to higher rights, which we value, such as liberty and life, members of the panel. And we think that at the point at which that right becomes tainted by having someone control the reins of power, then ultimately, members of the panel, you actually are infringing on this right, because it's no longer an objective right. It's a subjective right that's held to the whims of the government. Okay, so lastly, even with all of that done, does the embedded journalism plan actually provide any benefits? They talked about, kind of like how you would have information. You can get that through regular journalism. They talked about how, this eventually would lead to more trust. It was simply a warrant. What benefits did they show in all three of their speeches so far? I challenge Korey to come up here and tell me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Madam Speaker. So today I've been criticized consistently that I look like a professor. So if the shoe fits, wear it. And I'm going to take a couple people to school, and those So I hear a challenge here that I need to prove the benefits benefits of what we've been saying. And what my lesson plan will consist of, or aka what I will be talking about in this debate, is the nature of journalism, the couch potato dilemma, which is going to be sort of an examination of what we get when we watch TV, and then a soldier's story, which is I'll examine the relationship of Army and its citizens. So let's just get right into it now. So we hear from the second house that the nature of journalism, and that we have to determine if it's objective versus subjective information. And I came over in POI, yeah, it's sort of convoluted, I'll give him that, but now I have 7 minutes to clear this up. And is that, how does he know that the government is lying? Because he read a book, because he read an article, or he heard a story. But when you enact this motion, you stifle all these books, you stifle all these articles, you do not hear this anymore, you do not get the truth that will come out of embedded journalism. We think that, no thank you. We think that what our extension of here is also that the value of eyewitness accounts. Madam Speaker, embedded journalism is not cheap and it's not safe. There's obviously inherent value here, and what we think the inherent value is that this conceptualizing the cost of war. My partner came up here and brought the example of the Hotel Rwanda. No, not many people saw it, but we think that everyone's seen a war movie, everyone's seen or heard war stories, and we think that embedded journalism also provides this sort of truth and this sort of knowledge. No, thank you. And we think that this is why they do it in the first place. There's obviously some exact benefits of this, but then we also hear that, well, we can't make sure of this. I mean, because the government controls all of this. That the government pays all their salaries. But then if the government controls all of this, if the government finds benefits in doing this, then why is the government going to enact this motion in the first place? We get no dialogue of this. If they're getting some sort of benefit of controlling everything, then how is Congress going to say, all right, let's not do it anymore? I would love to hear that, Maria.
Okay, I'm devastated that it took 4 speeches for me to get this out, but I'd like the side opposition to give us an effective point of embedded journalism. You have not given any effective journalism examples, or embedded journalism examples.
We think that this is a principle of the truth of knowledge and the value of information. This is what we've been saying. Now, we don't need specific examples. You've got no specific examples of why it's harmful for you. You've only talked about other things. So now, that's going to move me on to my second point of contention here, and it's that the couch potato dilemma. And we think that this comes down to really truth versus comfort, Madam Speaker. We think that what we hear from the government side is that, the 24-hour news service is really bad. They're showing bad news. And what they would rather see is, I guess, a whole bunch of YouTube videos of squirrels riding on jet skis all day. I mean, it's going to be comforting for the people, and it's going to make the people feel good. We say no. We think that truth leads to change, and that's what we've been saying this entire debate, that people are going to see the bad and say they want to make a difference in the world. But comfort, what they bring, which makes everyone feel nice, brings conformity. We think that, that truth also brings this sort of knowledge, and knowledge is an end to itself. We think that when you're knowledgeable, you're more wisdom, and you can make better decisions in the world. And stifling embedded journalism only stifles the knowledge of our citizens. We think that it's not in the best interest of the government to do this. So, we also hear from the first side that this is going to be terrorist manipulation, and it kind of got completely ignored on there, because it's really not a good point, but because we don't see how U.S. journalism are going to be manipulated by terrorists. We're talking about U.S. journalism and U.S. news, so I don't understand this point here. But we think that, moreover, that, like they say, that the truth hurts. And we think that, but it needs to be present. We think that what we said over here is that if we don't get the truth, we're allowing the government to just completely steamroll over our rights, to hide under this veil of secrecy that they would think is the benefit of it. And we think this is going to be, we think that the informed constituencies are the best constituencies, and that we think that embedded journalism brings information from the eyewitness point, from the dilemma that at hand. So moving on now to the last point of contention. No, thank you. Moving on now is a soldier story, and this is really the relationship with the citizens and its military. We think that how do we gather this information anyways? How do we gather information from war? It's because of these embedded journalism. It's because of journalism itself. They say that this is going to not be an effective war, but you can have an effective war when you have what they think is blind support. They want a whole bunch of yes-man citizens. People are just saying yes, we support the troops. They want you to buy all these nice ribbons and say we support the troops blindly without any idea. But is this an effective war? Well, yeah, maybe you'll have easy time to legislate, but this is not the best war morally. We think that we want to fight a morally correct war. We want constituencies to be informed. We want empowerment of citizens. Go ahead before I go
Corey,
in.
can you honestly tell me that you believe with the high cost of human life that during World War II, with embedded journalists, we could have landed at Normandy?
I think that we don't necessarily just stop wars with embedded journalism. We're saying that people are going to be able not to question why we go to wars. So, moreover, I think what we're seeing here and presented from the government side is this sort of Orwellian society. If you ever read the book 1984, the citizens sit here and they watch telescreens all day, and they watch victory parades, and they just want to say, yeah, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning, everything's good. We think our citizens are smart enough to decipher if things are bad or good. But we don't think that we should just allow our citizens not have this ability to know the information, whether it be objective, subjective, or anything like that. We think that information in itself is valuable, and we'll allow our citizens to decipher it, whether it's objective, subjective, true, false, or not. So just to summarize this debate. So the nature of journalism, summarize what I've said so far. The nature of journalism. We think that this is how we get our information and how we trust our citizens to decipher if it's objective or subjective. We think that, we brought you here the value of eyewitness accounts. We think that this does conceptualize the cost of war. We heard, example of Normandy, but like you see in World War II, we had even video cameras. We had people to show what war was about. And we think that, especially when we fight wars in different countries, we need our citizens to know the cost of war. We think that, the constitutional dilemma, we think that truth leads to change, and comfort just leads to conformity. We want just to make people happy and comfortable, and send them, happy pills. We think that you need to know what the truth is, and you can get that with embedded journalism. And then we think that the relationship of the citizens, which is the relationships of the citizens in the army, that we shouldn't allow the army and the military to hide under the veil of secrecy and fight in effective wars. So thank you, Madam Speaker. Class is over. Go home and learn.